All right, we are on page 49 and we're continuing along with the same objective that we're going to factor a quadratic trinomial, which is the form ax squared plus bx plus c. And once again, we're focusing on ones where a does not equal 1. And we're always letting this flow chart kind of guide us. We always start with the greatest common factor. If there is one, we remove it. If there isn't one, we just continue on and we look at the number of terms. So if there's 2 terms, we look for the pattern of difference of 2 perfect squares, which is a perfect square minus a perfect square. If we have 3 terms, we use that box to be able to think through the process to be able to get back to our 2 factors. And then if we have 4 terms, we take those 4 terms and we group them into 2 groups and do the greatest common factor. So let's look at the problems on page 49. All right, our first one is 4x squared minus 14x plus 6. And so in my mind, the first thing I think I need to do is I need to look for a greatest common factor. So does this have a greatest common factor? My coefficients are 4, 14, and 6. We might notice that they are all even, and therefore our GCF is going to equal 2. So I'm going to take that greatest common factor and I'm going to divide it out of each term. And this is going to leave me with a 2x squared, a minus 7x, and a plus 3. Now that I've done that GCF, the next thing I'm going to look for is the number of terms. And this happens to have 3 terms. And so therefore that means I'm going to have to draw the box and figure out the 2 factors using some trial and error. So I'm going to take and draw the box. Now keep in mind that 2 was our greatest common factor. So at this point, it's going to show up in our answer, but we're not really using it to do anything here with the box. All right, let me anchor down what I know. I know that 2x squared has to be 2x times x. If I look at this, I could see that my constant right here is a positive 3. And remember that when we said that that c value is positive, that tells us that one of 2 things is true. That we either have multiplied together 2 positives or we've multiplied together 2 negatives. And so I can see by looking here at this middle term, and that middle term is negative, that I know that this is going to be that their factors are both going to be negative. So I'm going to take the 3 and write down my positive 3. Well, 3 can only be 1 times 3. That's all my factors for this. And I know that, we've already talked about, they both have to be negative, so it's going to be a negative 1 times a negative 3. So I'm going to put a negative 1 here and a negative 3 here. And then I can't skip this step. I have to check this because if it doesn't work out to negative 7x, I've got to make some adjustments. So negative 3 times x is negative 3x. Negative 3 times negative 1 is going to be a positive, 2x times a negative 1 is going to be a negative 2x. So look at what happens here. This is our 2x squared. Perfect. When we look at this, negative 3 minus 2 is going to give us a negative 5, and we need a negative 7. So that tells me that I need to adjust something. And since I know that they're both going to be negatives, the only thing that I can adjust is the placement of these numbers. So I'm going to try it again, but this time I'm going to take and put the 1, the negative 1 here, and I'm going to put the negative 3 here. And then I'm going to see how that changes these boxes and see if I can indeed get this to end up to a -7. So now when I go to multiply, -1 times x is -1x. 2x times the -3 is -6x. And when I go to check myself now, look at this. The -1 and the -6 are going to give us that -7 that we need. And so now I'm ready to write my final answer. If I look, here's one term, 2x minus 1. And then if I look here, here's my other term, x minus 3. Now, I have to be really careful, though, because if I say that that's my answer, I've missed something. Because remember, we use this right here, this greatest common factor. That greatest common factor must show up in our answer, and so we have to put a 2 out in front of that. There's our answer. Okay, let's go ahead and look at number 12. So number 12, 9x squared minus 33x plus 30. And remember, this is number 12 on page 49. So the first thing I think of is, let's look at it and see, does it have a greatest common factor? And I have a 9, a 33, and a 30. And all of those are divisible by 3. And so our greatest common factor is going to be a 3. And so I'm going to take and divide everything by 3. And so here's my greatest common factor of 3. And then this is going to be 3x squared. 3x squared minus 11x plus 10. And then, if I think about my flow chart, I have greatest common factors up top. I follow it down, and it tells me 3 terms. I'm going to look for a quadratic trinomial, and I'm going to take and draw this box. Now let's anchor in what we know. We know that the 3x squared has to come from 3x times x. Now let's look at what we know about our signs. If we look at our ax squared plus bx plus c, our constant value this time, our c value, is positive. And if that is a positive, what that tells us is that if c is positive, one of 2 things has happened. We either have to have a positive times a positive, or we have to have a negative times a negative. And so if we look at this middle term here, this middle term is a negative, and so what I'm looking for is a negative times a negative. Okay, so when I think about 10, now 10 has a couple more options. I can have, since we know they're both going to be negative, I could have -1 times -10, and I could have -2 times -5. Okay, now here's what we have to be careful about. I know that probably some of you will look at this and see that this is when we look at the -1 and -10 there, and say, well, if I add them, that's -11. This has got to be the correct one. But keep in mind that that would be true if this coefficient was 1. We've got this 3 here that's going to multiply things. Now, I'm not saying that it is not the correct answer, or that it's not the correct answer, but I'm saying we can't assume that like we did when our a value was 1. So I'm going to take, and I'm just going to start, I'm going to put the -1 here and the -10 here. And this would be a -1x, and this is going to be a -30x. And immediately when I hear that, I look at this, and oops, I didn't mean to do that. Now it won't let me undo it, sorry. When I look at this as a -x and a -30x, When I look at that, what that's going to tell me is that's a negative 31. And obviously that's not a negative 11. Now, with this one, I can't adjust the signs because I know that they both have to be negative. So the only thing I can adjust is the placement of the numbers. So I'm going to take the placement of the numbers and remove those. And I'm going to try the negative 10 here. And then negative 1 here. And so this would be negative 10 times x, negative 10x. And 3 times a negative 1, and that's going to be a negative 3x. And I still, when I add those together, I still don't get the negative 11 that I need. So what that tells me is that this is not the correct pair. The negative 1 and negative 10 is not correct. So I'm going to have to go to a different set of factors and see if that works. Fortunately, we only have one more set of factors to try. So I'm going to take now the negative 2 and the negative 5, and I'm going to put the negative 2 and the negative 5 there. I've just placed them. I might have to adjust them. Negative 2 times x, negative 2x. 3 times the negative 5, negative 15x. When I take and look at this here, that's going to give me a negative 17, so it's not correct. I can't adjust the signs. I know they're both negative. What I can do is adjust the location of these numbers. So I'm going to take and remove this. And now I'm going to take and put the negative 5 here, and then the negative 2 here. And then negative 5 times x, negative 5x. And 3 times a negative 2, a negative 6x. And look at what happens. When I combine those, that gives me the negative 11. So I wanted to show you this, and I purposely picked one that wouldn't work first and then moved to the one that did work to show you that you're going to have to try multiple things. You will most likely not get this on your first try, which is why I said, either get ready with a big sheet of paper to write a lot of these boxes, or just use paper and pencil and erase out like I do. Doesn't, obviously doesn't matter to me, but what you have to do is not get frustrated. You have to stick with it. It's going to take you a couple of times maybe to find that correct combination. So this is going to be 3x minus 5 right here, and then x minus 2 right there. Don't forget, this is the thing students forget all the time. We took out a greatest common factor of 3. That needs to show up in our answer right there.